So Lyon gets elected to Congress in 1797, and he shows up in Congress as this firm Jeffersonian and very antagonistic toward federalism. And immediately he becomes a controversial figure in Congress. As it turns out, Nathaniel Chipman's also in Congress. He's a senator from Vermont, and he writes home regarding Lyon. He says, "You cannot easily conceive how incredulous a figure he makes." People make fun of his accent. He's still got an Irish accent. They make fun of his name. They call him the Beast of Vermont. He's not very popular at all with the Federalists. And this is what Lyon has to say, and I think his response is very interesting. First, he says he had no pretensions of high blood. It's really a democratic response, I think. But he goes on, "This was my own country, because I have no other, and I own a share of it, which I bought by means of industry. I have fought for my country. In every day of trouble, I have repaired to her standard." So his attitude is, I don't care what you think of me, and I don't care about your standards either. It's very interesting. Okay. They also bring up the wooden sword thing, and this becomes the basis of the most famous incident in Lyon's life. On January 30th, 1798, there was a break for the business of the day in Congress, and Lyon was sitting around talking to some of his colleagues when he began to brag, and he said that he could go into Connecticut, run a newspaper, manage a press for 6 months, as he put it, and effect a revolution and turn out all the present representatives. In other words, Connecticut had these Federalist representatives. Lyon said he could get rid of them by use of a newspaper. And he was overheard by a guy named Roger Griswold, who was a Connecticut Federalist, and Griswold went up to him and said, "If you go into Connecticut, you better bring your wooden sword." Lyon attempted to ignore that. Griswold went up closer to him and said it again. "If you're going to go into Connecticut, you better bring your wooden sword." And Griswold grabbed Lyon's arm when he made that remark, and Lyon's reaction was to spit in his face. This is how Griswold reacted. "I knew that the fellow had been considered by every person ever since he came into Congress as a mere beast and the fool of the play, and that nothing which he could say could make any impression on those who heard him. I therefore felt no indignation, but merely contempt. To have made a serious reply would have been equally improper. He was too despicable to be entitled to resentment." A serious reply. What does he mean by a serious reply? What he means is to challenge Lyon to a duel. He decided he couldn't do that because to challenge a man to a duel is to acknowledge his equality to you. And Griswold thought that Lyon was beneath him, and therefore he wouldn't challenge him to a duel. Well, what he was counting on, though, was that Lyon would be kicked out of Congress for ungentlemanly behavior, and he wasn't. There's an attempt to expel him, but it fails along the new party lines that are forming. So Griswold waits a couple of weeks, and nothing is happening to Lyon. He appears to be getting away with this, and Griswold decides that he's got to punish Lyon in some way, rather than he being possibly seen as a coward. But he still doesn't want to challenge him to a duel. So if you aren't going to duel another man over an insult like this in this society, what do you do if you consider him too low to fight? Well, the answer is actually quite obvious. The answer is you treat him, you chastise him as you would a child or slave. You don't fight a duel with your slave, you beat him. Same thing with a kid. You don't fight a duel with a bad child. You give them a spanking. So with Griswold decides to do the same with Lyon. On February 15th, he approached him on the floor of the House, And Griswold tells this story. I called him a scoundrel and struck him with my cane and pursued him with more than 20 blows on his head and back until he got possession of a pair of fireplace tongs. When I threw him down, and after giving him several blows with my fist, I was taken off by his friends. And this is a cartoon of this event. And at the bottom you can see the caption says this: he in a trice struck Lion thrice upon his head in rage, sir, who seized the tongs to ease his wrongs, and Griswold thus engaged, sir. That's the end of the incident. Lion's version of the story was this: I did not come here to have my ass kicked by everybody. And neither one is expelled after the fight. But it makes Lion famous. And his fame is only going to continue to become important over the next couple of years. All right, we're going to go back to foreign policy a little bit. In 1797, there's an American delegation sent to negotiate with the French, and they're insulted. They're insulted by a demand for a bribe. And this becomes public knowledge, and it becomes known as the XYZ affair, because the Frenchmen demanding the bribes are known as X, Y, and Z. So this becomes public knowledge in America. It gets released for political purposes, in part to embarrass the Jeffersonians, and it does. And there's talk about warfare with France after this, and this is bad news for the Jeffersonians. And out of this XYZ affair come a couple of important events. The Republicans are on the defensive because of the XYZ affair, and they're tending toward favoring France. And Congress passes a couple of laws that really strengthen the hand of the Federalists in the hands of the President, in this case John Adams. Let me talk about them. They passed in 1798 the Naturalization Act that extends residence in the United States from 5 to 14 years for naturalization. The Alien Act, which allows the administration to arrest and deport aliens, foreigners, for treasonable leanings. And the Sedition Act, most famously. The Sedition Act criminalizes writing, speaking, or publishing anything of a false and scandalous, quoting here, false and scandalous nature against the government or the officers of the government. So if you insult the president, you've committed a crime under the Sedition Act. Very, very famous laws, of huge overstepping, as it turns out, on the part of the Federalists, and very important free speech precedent in 1798. Well, Lyons hates the Sedition Act and all these acts, as you can imagine, and his reaction is this: people had better hold their tongues and make toothpicks with their pens. In other words, you're not allowed to say or write anything anymore because you're liable to arrest. And there's something to it. There's a copy of the Sedition Act. Matthew Lyon is one of the first people arrested in October of 1798. He's indicted for something he'd written before the passage of the Sedition Act, but published in his newspaper after the passage of the Sedition Act. This is what he wrote. Actually, he didn't own the newspaper anymore. It was published in another paper. As to the executive, that is the president, when I see every consideration of the public welfare swallowed up in a continual grasp for power, in an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, or selfish avarice, when I shall behold men of real merit daily turned out of office for no other cause but independence of sentiment, when I shall see the sacred name of religion employed as a state engine to make mankind hate and persecute one another, I shall not be their humble advocate. Think about President Obama, President Bush, the kinds of insults people say about them every day, And you can see that this is actually a very mild political attack. Anyway, Lyon is arrested. He's tried in Rutland, Vermont, right on Route 7, if you know Rutland, right downtown Rutland. He's found guilty. He's sentenced to 4 months in jail and a $1,000 fine. That's a very, very hefty fine. And he goes to jail in Vergennes, Vermont. There's another view of Rutland. Well, while Lyon is in jail, he becomes truly famous. For one thing, he starts a new newspaper while he's in jail, and he calls it The Scourge of Aristocracy. He also inspires poetry. When the morning first blushed along in the east, I haste to my daily employment. I drudge all the day while the highborn can feast. 'Tis they that can afford the enjoyment. Our rulers can feast on $6 per day. The poor must be taxed their extortion to pay. And if I should unto them anything say, they would trump up a bill of sedition. Matthew Lyon's also the first congressman re-elected to Congress from jail. And he becomes a national figure. Here's a letter from Virginia. I enclose you an extract of a letter addressed by General Mason to Colonel Lyon, member of Congress from the District of Vermont, and now prisoner in the jail of Vergennes, as the first sacrifice on the altar of the sedition bill. As the most enormous lies have been circulated in this country respecting the Colonel's personal character, I beg leave to mention that he established the first smelting house at his iron foundry that there was in the state of Vermont, and that he has eminently promoted the manufactures of that state. So he becomes famous. People in Virginia are talking about him. This is what Jefferson writes about him after he's reelected. Lyon is elected. His majority is great. So Lyon becomes a martyr to free speech and a hero to the Republicans. And when he's reelected to Congress, there's a debate about whether to seat him because he's in jail. And that debate becomes a watershed of the defense of free speech in this country. So Lyon becomes a martyr to free speech, and after the election of 1800, the sedition bill, alien and sedition bills are repealed, and he's a hero of free speech. And these slides here are some of the type of newspapers printed in 1800, the Republican newspapers. So Watch for the Republic here, On Guard for Liberty, that's a Liberty cap in the upper left-hand corner. And the Tree of Liberty, these things aren't always very subtle. The Herald of Liberty, and the story here is that all of these Republican papers are standing up for Matthew Lyon, standing up for the endangered liberties that the Federalists have been threatening with these terrible laws, and they were terrible laws. Okay, the election of 1800. The election of 1800 is, you may have heard, one of the most bitter elections in American history. Jefferson's running for president against President Adams, who's the standard bearer of the Federalists. All of this stuff we've been talking about in this lecture, the French Revolution, the XYZ affair, the question of England versus France, the nature of the economy, the character of Alexander Hamilton, all of this stuff is at issue. It's a very, very hard-fought and bitter election, and here we have Federalist attack on Thomas Jefferson, attempting to destroy the Constitution, and here we have Jefferson in the embrace of the devil. All of these arguments, which are about the type of future America should have, are in play. And here's a Republican banner about turn out and save your country from ruin. Down with the Tories, they're calling the Federalist Tories, down with the British faction. So very, very heated election, an ugly election. Jefferson and Adams' personal friendship is in tatters for many years after this, and Jefferson wins. There is the vote. Now, you can see that Adams wins Vermont, so Matthew Lyon doesn't really carry his own state for Jefferson at all. Lyon campaigns in the South. He's a national figure by this point. He's a kind of symbol. You haul him out at these different rallies. People cheer him. He campaigns in the South as a Republican icon and votes for Jefferson in the House of Representatives and is a loyal Republican. And he decides, by the way, after this trip to the South, that there's more opportunity than there is in Vermont. And he sells out in Vermont, and in 1801 moves to Kentucky. And while he's in Kentucky, he starts all over as he had in Vermont. He builds a sawmill. He builds a paper mill. He builds a grist mill. He buys a cotton gin. His main business, however, there's where he lives in Kentucky, is operating a barge business on the Ohio River. And to do this, he buys a small number of slaves. The reason he does that is because there's no white labor. White men aren't going to work as employees of a barge company. So he starts this barge company. He buys some slaves. But Lyon really is a Democrat. He really does believe in democracy, in other words. And he also knew what it was like to be unpaid labor. He started his own life as a teenage indentured servant, as we mentioned before. So he makes a deal with his slaves. He tells them that they will earn their buying price back from him in 5 years, and after that, he'll free them. In other words, treats them as indentured servants rather than as slaves, and he keeps his word. He goes bankrupt in 1816, and after that, he moves again to Arkansas, where he dies in 1822, and his body's brought back to Kentucky, down there in the southwestern corner of Kentucky, near the Ohio River there, the juncture of the Ohio and the Mississippi. And I think it's Mayfield he's living, Eddyville, Kentucky. And there's his grave in Eddyville, Kentucky. So that's the story of Matthew Lyon. Matthew Lyon is somebody who is a new Democratic personality, and what I mean by that is that he's not only an avid believer in democracy, he's assertively Democratic. He won't back down. He challenges this federalist idea of the deference in politics, and leadership has to come from a leadership class and all that sort of thing. He's also someone who's very entrepreneurial. He's also someone who's willing 3 times in his life to move to new frontiers. So in all of these ways, Matthew Lyon represents the future. He's a very interesting transitional figure from this period of the founding fathers and their elevated leadership to a period of a more robust democracy, a more wide open society that really people like Washington and Hamilton didn't anticipate. So Lyon points us to the future in America, the 19th century, where things are going to be a lot more wide open, and we'll talk about that in some future lectures.